Captain Jack Churchill crouched behind a crumbling stone wall near the French village of L'Épinette at 7:42 on the morning of May 27, 1940, watching 5 German soldiers advance through the mist with a 6-foot English longbow drawn taut in his hands instead of a rifle. 33 years old. 14 years since Sandhurst. 0 confirmed kills. The entire British expeditionary force was running for Dunkirk around him. Officers burning documents in ditches, men throwing away rifles just to move faster, and Churchill was standing his ground with a weapon that belonged in a museum. He wasn't improvising. Churchill had represented Great Britain at the World Archery Championships in Oslo less than a year earlier. Good enough to put an arrow through a playing card at 50 yards. Good enough to kill a man before that man ever registered the shot had been fired. The German patrol closed to 30 yards, a veteran sergeant leading them, eyes checking hedges and windows for rifles and grenades, never once looking for a medieval weapon. Churchill drew to his ear, held, and released. The sergeant dropped without a sound, and it became, by most accounts, the last confirmed longbow kill of the entire war. The British Army had never quite known what to do with him. Sandhurst graduate, Burma veteran, a man who'd quit soldiering entirely in 1936 out of sheer boredom, worked as a newspaper editor in Nairobi, appeared in films as an archer, ridden a motorcycle across Burma and India, and once crashed it into a water buffalo. When war broke out in 1939, he rejoined his regiment carrying his competition longbow, a basket-hilted Scottish broadsword, and a set of Highland bagpipes he'd taught himself during his years abroad. His fellow officers thought him eccentric at best. Churchill had his own theory nobody in London's war planning offices had considered. A rifle was a threat every soldier had trained against. But a man charging with a screaming bagpipe tune and a broadsword raised overhead was something no training manual had ever prepared them for. And in close combat, a single second of confused hesitation was often the only difference that mattered. If you want to see how a man armed with medieval weapons fared against Hitler's panzer divisions, hit that like button. It helps us bring you more stories like this one. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Churchill. By December 1941, he was second in command of No. 3 Commando, standing in the bow of a landing craft off the frozen Norwegian island of Vagsø, with 105 men behind him, and a naval bombardment thundering across the fjord. When the ramp dropped onto the rocky beach at 8:48 that morning, Churchill didn't draw his weapon first. He stood in the freezing surf and played "The March of the Cameron Men" on his bagpipes, while German gunners who'd trained to fight rifles and grenades simply stared, unable to process the sound cutting through their own explosions. He finished the tune, set the pipes down, threw a grenade, drew his broadsword, and led the charge himself. The assault on Moy Island took under 10 minutes. Coastal guns destroyed, an anti-aircraft battery overrun, prisoners taken, resistance crushed by men moving with a speed the German garrison had no answer for. Word came in that the main force assaulting South Vagsø itself was pinned down by reinforcements nobody had accounted for in the planning. Street fighting bogged down building by building. Churchill crossed the strait, led a flanking attack down a side street with his sword still drawn, and helped break a deadlock that had cost the operation 17 dead and 53 wounded by the time the town was finally cleared. Hitler personally ordered 30,000 additional troops diverted to garrison duty across the Norwegian coast after that single raid. An entire division of soldiers who might otherwise have fought in Russia, tied down by 300 commandos, and a man with a sword. By September 1943, now commanding No. 2 Commando in the invasion of Italy, Churchill's men held the town of Vitry-sur-Mare against 5 straight days of German counterattacks, low on ammunition, and refusing to give ground. When intelligence identified a German observation post directing artillery fire onto the Allied beachhead from the hills above Molina, Churchill judged correctly that 2 men could reach it silently, where 200 would be spotted and slaughtered. He took a single corporal and moved through the darkness before dawn, using drainage ditches and stone walls for cover, and found the first German position by the glow of cigarettes, at a relaxed mortar crew who'd never trained for an officer who simply materialized out of the dark with a drawn broadsword and calm authority. They surrendered instantly. He used his revolver lanyard to lead that prisoner to the next position, and repeated the process, again and again, until dawn broke over 42 captured German soldiers and an entire mortar squad marched down the mountain by one officer and one corporal, armed with nothing more than a sword, a revolver, and absolute nerve. By spring 1944, he was fighting alongside Tito's partisans on the Dalmatian coast, and in May, his mixed force of British commandos and Yugoslav fighters landed on the German-held island of Brač. The partisans hesitated at the fortified hilltop positions rather than pressing the advantage of surprise, and by morning, the Germans had reorganized completely. Churchill pushed the assault forward anyway, bagpipes playing, sword at his side, when a German mortar team finally found the range and dropped a salvo directly onto the group of commandos gathered around him. Every man in that group was killed or wounded except Churchill himself, who'd been standing slightly apart, still playing, alone on a hillside surrounded by his own dead and dying, ammunition exhausted, escape impossible. Churchill did the only thing that felt honest to him. He sat down on a rock, picked the bagpipes back up, and played "Will Ye No Come Back Again," a Scottish farewell, while German soldiers approached with rifles raised and simply couldn't bring themselves to shoot a man facing them like that. A grenade thrown from somewhere in the confusion finally knocked him unconscious. He woke up a prisoner, flown to Berlin on the mistaken assumption that anyone named Churchill must be related to the Prime Minister, and eventually transferred to Sachsenhausen concentration camp north of Berlin, held in a special compound for prisoners considered valuable as hostages. Sachsenhausen was not built for men like him. Within weeks, he'd mapped the guard rotations, identified the weak points in the perimeter, and begun digging a tunnel from a garden drainage ditch, using spoons and bare hands, concealing the excavated dirt under compost piles at night. On September 23, 1944, Churchill and 4 fellow officers crawled through 100+ feet of tunnel to freedom, emerging into the German countryside with nothing but what they could carry. He and RAF officer Bertram James walked north through Nazi Germany for 2 weeks, stealing vegetables and drinking from streams, aiming for the Baltic coast and a boat to neutral Sweden, caught within a few kilometers of the water, arrested, and returned to captivity, though not to Sachsenhausen. He spent the winter of 1944 into 1945 in an Austrian mountain camp, watching the war collapse around him from the wrong side of a fence. When the SS finally abandoned a column of prisoner hostages in a small Italian village in late April 1945, rather than risk executing them under a Wehrmacht unit's protection, most of the liberated men waited for Allied forces to reach them. Churchill didn't wait. Injured ankle, no food, no weapons, no identification. He walked roughly 90 miles south through the Italian Alps on his own, reaching an American reconnaissance unit near Verona 8 days later, and convincing them by sheer force of personality alone that a ragged, unarmed man, claiming to be a British lieutenant colonel, was telling the truth. He made it home in May 1945 just as Germany surrendered, and immediately volunteered for the Pacific. One more battle, one more beach, one more chance to carry his sword ashore. He was somewhere over India when the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and Japan surrendered before he ever got the invasion he'd been training for. He reportedly complained, only half joking, that without the American bombs, the war might have lasted another 10 years, a line that said more about his own restless nature than any real regret about the deaths avoided. Peacetime never suited him. He qualified as a parachutist in his 40s, simply to feel the rush again, trained new generations of commandos, helped evacuate 700 trapped Jewish medical staff from Mount Scopus in Jerusalem in 1948. Through calm negotiation, rather than force. Reasoning, in his own words, that people were less likely to shoot at someone smiling at them. In 1955, at 48 years old, he stood on the banks of England's River Severn with a homemade board and rode the tidal bore for over a mile, becoming one of the first river surfers in British history, simply because a wave existed and he needed to be on it. He died in 1996 at 89, and one British newspaper wrote afterward that if Jack Churchill hadn't actually existed, no one would have dared invent him. No fictional hero built from a longbow kill, a sword-led beach assault, 42 prisoners taken with a corporal and steel, an escape from a Nazi camp, and a river wave ridden in his own backyard would have seemed remotely believable. If this story moved you the way it moved us, hit that like button. Everyone tells YouTube to put this story in front of more people. Subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing stories like this one out of the archive every single week. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from, and tell us if you'd ever heard of Mad Jack Churchill before today. Thanks for watching, and thanks for making sure Jack Churchill doesn't disappear into silence.